to see some serious shit.
This is certainly going to be the most ambitious Moan of the Week that we've ever done, for two reasons. Firstly, because we're actually talking about two films tonight for the price of one. 1983's The Day After, directed by Nick Meyer, who surely needs no introduction to anyone listening to this show, and 1984's Threads, produced and directed by Mick Jackson, who also directed the film that I chose for us to talk about months and months ago, Indictment, the McMartin Trial. Both films deal with the exact same subject matter, that of the fear and then reality and then the aftermath of a nuclear holocaust. Both films were made for television. One was made in America, one was made in the UK by the BBC. Both films were made of their time, to comment directly on their time, and for the people watching it at that time, which makes them more interesting films to look up back at now and see whether they still hold up or whether they've become painfully dated. And also, these two films are proof positive that you can tell the exact same story in two completely different ways. And seeing how closely related the films are, I didn't think it was fair to talk about one without the other. So that's what we're going to do tonight. But the second reason is this is a special installment because for the first time, we're joined by a special guest. You would have heard him on our podcast. Writer, producer, director, editor, although not on either of these films, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Robert Meyer Burnett.
Hello, it's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
My first question, Robert, would be, what's your personal connection to The Day After and Threads? How did you first see them? What made you want to join us bunch of kids to talk about them?
Well, I was in high school when The Day After was broadcast. And when it was on, there was a huge controversy about whether or not underage children should be allowed to watch it. There was really, in my school, there was information packets sent out. It was on the news. It was everywhere. And people made this seem like this was the most difficult film to watch that any young person could possibly see. I even wrote an article about this movie for my high school newspaper about why we should see it. And the fact that it's a little hard to understand now, but back then we still were in the midst of the Cold War. And the looming idea of nuclear holocaust that existed since the 50s was very, very real. Russia was in Afghanistan at the time. There was all kinds of international tensions. Now it seems really, I think, especially for younger people, the whole idea of mutually assured destruction is a little silly when we live in a world post 9/11 where people will either blow up London subways or they'll destroy the World Trade Center. But the idea that the entire world is going to come to an end is sort of a different thing. But the world I grew up in, it was very, very real. And to show on a mass scale a very realistic depiction of what would happen to small-town America in the midst of a nuclear attack was a really audacious thing to do. And I remember turning on the TV and watching the show and feeling a little scared about what I was going to see. Would I be able to take it? Even though I was a total gorehound and The Exorcist and Dawn of the Dead were my favorite movies. But it's still, I wondered, would it disturb me? Because I used to have dreams about dying in nuclear fire.
I knew about it because I'm a nerd, and I am a big fan of Nick Meyer. And I knew he had directed a film about nuclear war. That's all I knew, and I watched it, and it was terrifying. I think the other thing about this movie that we should remember is that you say nuclear war circa mid-'80s, what are you thinking of? You think of Mad Max. You think of ass-kicking action sequences of Mel Gibson. No, seriously.
No, it's true. I didn't think of that.
You think of Mel Gibson in the leather suit with his dog sidekick kicking ass.
I think from the perspective of time, it makes all the difference in the world. When I was re-watching The Day After this week, the first thing that catches you, of course, is how the movie opens. And how does it open? It opens with, slick opening credits, panoramic views of the country, and sweeping music. It opens like an Irwin Allen film. It opens like any Hollywood-made disaster movie. And
it opens with a score that's kind of melancholy.
Yeah. I guess so, and it's a good score, absolutely. But it just, if John Williams was the composer on that, it wouldn't have surprised me at all. And there's a logical approach to its storytelling. You know, it starts by showing Sleepy Town, USA, and the happy people that live there. It's showing a world not paying attention to the threat of imminent nuclear war. It's showing stock traders in the pits trying to make money that they'll never live to spend, and doctors treating patients with problems which will seem so redundant in a few days' time. And then you get, you know, like you would in a traditional disaster movie, I guess, which shows a wide, diverse range of people and careers across all of the country. You get different stories, and we get introduced gradually, and it's a slow burn. We have the older couple, Dr. Oakes, played by Jason Robards, and his wife, who we're told they decided to conceive their daughter right when the Cuban Missile Crisis was at its peak. And then, you know, they looked up and they saw that the bombs never came. And now they're faced with living through the same situation, of course inclined to believe that history will repeat itself and nothing will happen. You've got the Dahlbergs, the prototypical American family, right out of every disaster movie, with the happy homemaker mother and the farmer father, and at least 3 children, one of whom, of course, is now at that rebellious teenage age where she's running off with Jeff East on his bike every 5 minutes, and she's getting married tomorrow, you know, and the father protests, although, you know, not in an entirely cliched way. It seems that he's protesting more, not because Jeff East is a bad person, but just because he's taking seriously what's coming, and we've all got bigger problems on our hands as far as our future is concerned than here getting married and having children. And of course you've got the guy in the Air Force who has to leave his wife due to the alert that she thought would never come. Once the actual panic sets in this film, it feels much quicker. There's much more urgency to it than in Threads. In The Day After, you very much feel like people are caught off guard. You know, they don't know. Of course, they're living under a cloud of constant threats of nuclear annihilation, but no one is taking it seriously, really. It happens, and no one has a chance to react, to prepare. It just happens. You know, you get the supermarket looting scene. And by the way, interesting thing I noticed about the supermarket scene is when Jeff East walks out of the supermarket, I noticed on the frontage that supermarket, that was its grand opening sale. You see it on the front of the supermarket. I thought that was just a cheap. As a funny little thing. God, I bet the managers thought, why didn't we open sooner? God damn it.
A little bit of humor.
Just a bit. An otherwise bleak movie. And another thing that I noticed is that very little attention is given to the actual reason for the conflict in the first place, why there are tensions between East and West, and why we're launching against each other. And you can make the argument that the film was made in its time, for its time, and the issue was so prevalent in the media that you didn't need to waste any of the film explaining it to the audience. And as such, though, that tends to weaken the film, looking at it today. I would make the argument myself that Nick Meyer intentionally glosses over any explanation, or more importantly, justification on either side for nuclear war, because there is no justification for it. And he doesn't want to humanize the people pushing the buttons. He doesn't want to rationalize the conflict. You know, what is worse than having the world destroyed but never knowing or understanding why it happened? That's the position these characters in, and that's where most of its strength comes from.
Make it pretty, Ollie. This is my last trim as a free man. I'm getting married tomorrow.
Is that right?
Yep.
Well, congratulations. Now.
Who knows? The president's speaking on television at 6 tonight. Maybe he'll tell us something new.
Well, they'll tell us what they want us to hear. Keep the panic at the low sweat stage.
I really don't think either side wants to be the first to use a nuclear device.
You know, it's not a question of who, but where. Over whose real estate. Say we explode a nuclear bomb over their troops on our side. The fallout had better not drift over to their side.
They're crazy. How do they expect it's going to stop with just one bomb?
You want to know what crazy is? Crazy's not staying out of other people's business. We shouldn't be over there in the first place.
Well, maybe they'll contain it. After all, I've still got symphony tickets for tonight.
The thing that bothers me is that damn Lantron warning.
What's that?
That's when one side tells the other that they're going to fire their missiles as soon as they think the other guy's missiles are already on the way.
You know, use them or lose them.
What do you really think the chances of something like that happening way the hell out here in the middle of nowhere?
Nowhere? There's no nowhere anymore. You're sitting next to the Whiteman Air Force Base right now. That's about 150 Minuteman missile silos spread halfway down the state of Missouri. That's an awful lot of bullseyes.
Well, what I was going to say is I think you identified very well that one of the great differences between Threads and The Day After is The Day After is very metaphoric in terms of America itself. We've seen the whole way the movie is set up. It displays the apple pie American dream. Kansas is supposed to metaphorically stand for not necessarily urban America, meaning New York and LA, but the dream of what the American way of life is. And it's very much a conceit. It's very much a movie. You know, you're watching this sort of metaphoric version of perfection of America, of what small town America is really like. And to me, it's a very it's not superficial, but it's very much the party line about if you were going to make a brochure about what America is and send it abroad to people, the opening of The Day After is exactly what that brochure would have in it. And there's not a lot of nuance or subtlety about, say, what it's like to live on the streets of New York City. It's not urban America. It's this myth of what America is. If you were to get into the nuts and bolts of what the conflict is, it would get in the way of illustrating this myth of what America is supposed to be. The idea is that people in America who are going about their daily lives are really not aware of what's going on in terms of international politics. They're not really too concerned about it as long as they've got the supermarket, as long as they can go to the baseball game or deal with their local church and their local schools and their mom and pop lives. I mean, it did a great job of establishing the fact that most of Americans are pretty oblivious.
Yeah, I wanted to say that the reactions of the characters in The Day After as opposed to the characters in Threads, it was fascinating to see how the build-up to the actual attack and the reaction to the attack was different for the Americans as opposed to the Brits. Because in Threads, you see like the British kids are all in the pub and you see the news reports on the news and the guy goes to change the channel and everybody starts screaming at him to turn it back because they want to know what's going on. They're constantly having these specials airing on TV about what to do if somebody dies in your house and how to bury them in the backyard, as opposed to the Americans who seem to sort of stick their heads in the sand and just sort of ignore it. I mean, there's that moment where you see the actual nuke going up in the air, and then they cut back to the farm with the Dahlbergs, where the guy's going upstairs to get his wife, and she's just up there just making that bed, and she's refusing to go downstairs to go into the basement. It was shocking to me to have that cutaway from that bomb going up to, oh, I'm upstairs just making the bed. It's not like nuclear winter is about to happen. We're all about to die. So that was very fascinating to me. I'm not sure if that was meant to be sort of an indictment of Americans and the way that we react to news as opposed to the way that Brits react, where they seem a bit more involved and we're just sort of not. I'm not sure what that was supposed to be, but...
Well, I would imagine if the film is making commentary about anybody, then it is about the American public, because one of the other things you notice about The Day After is that very little commentary or criticism is made about the government, about administration. There's, I think, one scene where after the blast, some of the characters are listening to the president's speech, who appears to be very cushy in his bunker somewhere, doesn't appear to be harmed at all, and he makes a speech which is very, very genetic, kind of like, just hang on in there, and at the end they turn off and like, one of the characters just says, is that it? And that's literally, as far as I could tell, the only commentary or criticism that is made about government. Probably because the film was very specifically made to try and enact change. And
Well, it's funny you say that because the movie was made partially by Nick Meyer's own admission in a wonderful Empire magazine article from, I actually want to date this, November of 2010. If you have that issue, that's the one to look up. A very thorough article about the development of The Day After. And, Meyer's very honest. He goes, I wanted to get Reagan out of office.
Mm-hmm.
He was, there was a real concern about, he'd be the guy to hit the button. He turned out not to be that guy. But still,
it's soft in that regard. It doesn't really criticize, I don't think, the government. And one of the things you have to take with a grain of salt when we talk about this film as opposed to Threads, as far as I know, Threads was released uncut. It's hard to imagine there's a harsher version of that film. The Day After there's at least 20 minutes of footage that was not shown in the released version. Nick Meyer's preferred cut was at least 2 hours 20 minutes, and that was chopped. In fact, the experience of making that film was so horrible, I don't think he worked in television again. And there was lots that was cut from the original script. Maybe there's a lot more politics, a lot more criticism of the administration in the original version that had to be cut. It's hard to know, and there's
something else. In 1983, John Badham's movie War Games with Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy came out. And that film also deals with, in terms of the fear of nuclear holocaust, which is when the Whopper computer, there's a very real possibility that there's going to be a global thermonuclear war in that film. And that sort of deals with that same kind of fear. And if you were to watch, say, War Games and The Day After back to back, one is all about that fear, and then one is the realization of that fear. But it's very much done in a even The Day After, as harsh as it gets, you never get the idea that you're feeling it the way you're feeling Threads, and maybe that's because it's done in such a Hollywood way. The movie is such a glossy production, and it's very distancing in that sense. I mean, you're watching a story about a nuclear holocaust, but you're always watching a movie.
Right.
It doesn't have the impact of say what happens in Threads. It's not the 70s documentary style version of the same story, which is what Threads is. So it's very distancing. As much as I thought The Day After was depressing on an intellectual level, I don't think I felt it emotionally.
Yeah, I wanted to say I absolutely agree with Robert, because part of what makes Threads much more affecting to me is that I don't recognize any of those people who are in that, so I can fully buy into them as being those characters, and that's it. I watch The Day After, I'm looking around, I'm seeing, oh, there's Steve Guttenberg, and oh, there's John Lithgow, and it's clearly a Hollywood movie. Clearly they weren't as known at the time this movie came out as they are now, but still watching it, I'm seeing people who I recognize, so I'm always cognizant of the fact that, yeah, it's bad, but it's still just a movie. Threads was not just a movie to me. That was just unbearable.
Well, no, but also, I mean, it's like, you think about the cast at the time, 1983, the only recognizable names were Jason Robards, who'd won 2 Oscars, and as silly as this sounds, Stephen Furst, or the gentleman who played Flounder in Animal House. Those are the only recognizable actors, really, because nobody remembered Jeff East from Superman, and John Lithgow had not really broken out yet, although he had been nominated for.
Well, but remember, you had Joe Beth Williams was in Poltergeist.
That's right.
And Steve Guttenberg, and I mean Lithgow had been in thing. He'd won his Academy Award for every World According to Garp.
Right.
And so there were people that were. What was interesting was these are people that you saw on the movie screen that were now on television. They weren't television stars; they were movie stars that were now in this. That was another thing that gave the movie a certain amount of heft and weight, is that it was not only was it important because of its subject matter, it was important because the actors in it were movie stars that had agreed to be in this TV movie. So there was weight to it there.
I think the biggest thing is that, as you say, it's glossy, but it's also broad. It's very broad. There's no, I'm being harsh here, but it's not subtle. Talking about what's happening in the movie is easy. I think the most affecting scene, broad as it is, in the film, maybe in either film, I'm not quite sure, is the one that Christina mentioned, where Bibi Besh is making the bed upstairs, and her husband comes in to get her into the basement because the missiles have launched. It started. There's no more debating, and she won't listen. She blocks him out, and she has to be dragged away, and she starts screaming. She's the happy homemaker. She's not asked for much from the world. She just wants to keep her house in order, make her children's beds. She wants to get her daughter married off, and she can't even have that. And she knows in that moment, much as she wants to deny it, that she'll never have those things again. This is the end, and it's whereas everyone else has been kind of accepting it, and it's been more of a slow burn, for her it's just a little jolt.
What is it? Day or night?
It's day, I think.
What day?
Wednesday.
It's Thursday. 2:30.
I wonder if it's sunny out.
I can't remember.
Can't remember what?
It's only been 5 days, and I can't remember what Bruce looks like.
Well, now we all been through a lot, sitting here in the dark.
What are we doing down here anyway? It's all over, isn't it? It smells so bad down here, I can't even breathe.
Now listen, Denise, you get a hold of yourself. Now you know that we cannot go out of here until...
Why did I have to use that thing? We'd be married by now anyway. Why didn't I at least get pregnant?
Just pipe down, Denise.
Because now I can't even see his face. I can't see anything. I can't see anything. I can't see anything.
Denise, honey, now just calm down. Get hold of it.
Let go of me. I can't see. You can't. Don't go in there. No.
Wait a minute. I'll get it. I owe you.
No, Jim.
No. It only looks that way. Hey. Hey. You can't see it. You can't feel it. And you can't taste it. But it's here. Right now, all around us. It's going through you like an X-ray. Right into your cells. What do you think killed all these animals?
I think probably the best moment actually, is the very end of the film. And not even any footage in the film, but a caption. You know, once we've seen these characters go through what they go through, and we like these characters, especially Jason Robards, who I guess we follow the most through the film, and that's who the movie ends on. That particular part, as I feel like slips into dementia, and you know, as well as having been burned and poisoned by radiation, and finally going back to his home to find what he finds. And after all of that, after that high emotional peak, we have a caption which says, and I'm paraphrasing here, this was a depiction, a fictional depiction, a dramatization of what could happen. The actual reality will probably be much, much worse. And what a segue to talk about the other film, which is the BBC film Threads.
Well, I have to say that I'll never forget when I first saw Threads. And if I remember correctly, it aired on a PBS station here. I watched on our PBS affiliate in Seattle. And I would equate the way that a movie like The Exorcist was using 70s documentary style, how the movie's set in a house that's done in a very realistic manner, even though it depicts demonic possession. The reason The Exorcist is so effective is it's because it's done in that documentary, very relentlessly realistic style. And Threads did the same thing. I mean, from the beginning, you're dealing with working class people in working class neighborhoods with working class lives, and you're not in the middle of Parliament. You're not in the middle of Thames House. You're dealing with everyday people, and it's done in such a relentlessly realistic way. They're at the pubs, they're in these very modest homes, normal workaday folks, and everything you're watching, the color, it's shot in 16 millimeters, so it's not beautifully photographed and composed the way The Day After is, and you can't help but immediately be drawn in and think what you're watching is almost a documentary. I mean, it's certainly presented that way, that you're watching something that's really happening right now. And that's what immediately drew me in and why I was so devastated by that film.
Yeah, I love that you say that it's relentlessly realistic, because that's the perfect way to describe this. I was talking to Phil through emails, and I was talking about how, I don't know if I was telling you, Phil, or it was you, Jamie. It might have been you, Jamie. I was talking about the title cards that pop up during this film and how it's almost callous how lacking in emotion it is. Just how straightforward it is, just telling you, yep, 5 weeks after, this is what's going to happen. 6 weeks after, this is what's going to happen. And it doesn't for 1 second bend and go towards being maudlin and giving you some sort of little happy ray of light, little bit of sunshine at the end to make you think, okay, it's bad now, but they'll be able to keep their heads above water. It's going to be okay in the end. No, you don't get happiness in the end. You get a fucking stillborn baby and a girl screaming or about to scream before just. Oh my God!
And what about that is brilliant is that it presents this technique that you're sort of fucking with the audience, because it's saying that this is a computer showing what happened, and this is hundreds of years in the future, and they're showing us from 1984 how the world ended and how it took hundreds of years later to catch up. That's one way to interpret it. And yet by that last scene, we see the girl giving birth to the dead baby. It says, no, it's over. They're fucked. Humanity's over. They can't reproduce. And what's left of the first generation after the nuclear strike, they're Neanderthals. They can't speak English. There's so much about this movie. I saw it Monday. I can't shake it.
I mean, even The Day After, when The Day After reaches its conclusion, there's hope. In a way, some of these people survived, and humanity kind of will go on, and they still live in Kansas, whereas if you look at Threads, what happens, it's just so relentless that you know that the world is over. We're all finished. That there's no inkling that we would ever survive what occurs in that movie. Whereas in The Day After, once it's over, it's like, okay, that was disturbing, but tomorrow's another day.
Right.
Whereas in Threads, there are no more tomorrows. And if there are, they're just going to get worse. And that's what I think is so devastating about the film. And also what was really interesting about Threads is you deal with the how interesting is it that it's a situation in Iran that's escalating out of control. And you're very aware of that. The Russians are in Iran. The United States counter their actions in Iran. And even today, meaning this day, right now, you've got interesting things going on with Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, and we're no longer worried about nuclear war, but the idea of Iran becoming a nuclear power is still at the forefront of our minds, because we know that Iran, if they do become a nuclear power, would have no problem using nuclear weapons. And while they won't destroy the world, they could certainly destroy Israel, and they wouldn't have any problem using them. And now we live in a world where we won't let a country like Iran or Persia, whatever you want to call it, become a nuclear power, because they have no problem using nuclear weapons. And that's how our world has drastically changed. The idea of a limited nuclear exchange or a dirty bomb or say a city like New York getting taken out by a terrorist nuclear device is not out of the realm of possibility. In fact, it's something that we actually think is going to happen at some point.
Well, we also just talk about the attack sequence in both films. This movie is an example of, and I know we've all heard this phrase before, is art thriving through restriction, because, Day After had a budget. And yes, it was television, but they still had some money to do elaborate makeup effects to what happens to these characters. We see Steve Guttenberg dying of radiation at the end of the film. He doesn't overtly die, but we know he's going to.
Right.
It's more harrowing. It's more powerful to have what they do in Threads, which is you have people with torn up blankets covering half their face and red makeup. That says more than what any kind of elaborate makeup can do. And even the attack sequence, there's a single shot, and there's so many images in this movie that have burned into my head that I'll never get out. But there's one single shot that, with no pun intended, it destroys the day after. It is when the nuke goes off, people are running down the street, and there's a woman probably in her late 40s, early 50s who just stands there, covers her mouth, and then she urinates herself.
Oh, yeah.
That destroys any kind of impact the day after might have had, because they went that far.
Also, the perspective never changes. You know, you never move out of that city block to go see some beautiful shot of a nuclear explosion. You're always on the ground. It's always shot from the perspective and the point of view of those characters. It's like when you see that one human body immolating in the brick wreckage, you know, and it's just melting. But you never get away. You never have a God's eye point of view of the nukes going off. You always see them going off from, like, down on the city street or something from the perspective of the characters.
And it's not just that, though. It's like the animation, the protect and survive animation, which I had no idea was real. And I thought that was scary watching the movie. And then I realized it was real, and I actually went on YouTube and watched 2 of them, and I said, I can't finish this. There's about 20 of them they produced in the 70s.
Yeah.
I couldn't finish it. It's horrifying. That music, and, like, what to do with a body. And I'm not, the way I just did my voice, it makes it sound like it's goofy. No, it's straight.
I think I think the scene that sticks out to me more than any, the one that just will never shake, it's not a scene of violence or death or grotesqueness or anything like that. It's the scene where, you know, Ruth and Jimmy are in their newly bought apartment painting the walls, and this PSA is playing in the background. Yeah. Very straight. The announcer is saying like he's reading the 6 o'clock news. If the body is more than 5 days old, please bury it outside. Just in the most straight-laced way, and she just breaks down, as in anyone was. Because, I mean, those shorts were produced by the government, but were only meant, as I understand it, to be broadcast if we were 72 hours away from an attack, or something roughly in that area, only in times of an emergency. So, playing into that, obviously, just the idea that they're releasing this kind of thing, it's real, it's happening, it's just a question of when. What is the point of decorating your home? And it's that's what's scary to me about Threads more than anything. It's the fact that these people have time to prepare for the attack. In the day after, they get caught off guard. In Threads, the slow burn means everything. The fact
when it suddenly comes up, Phil, they're having the middle of a regular bureaucratic meeting.
Yeah.
The camera just cuts to, and you don't think of anything of it, and it goes, attack. I mean, my heart dropped.
Hired community workers, they're not trained for this. They've just been thrust into this part of responsibility, and like, is that real? Like you would if it was the first time you heard a fire drill at your place of work. Is that for real now? You know, it's for bloody real.
Yeah, you have that overview shot of the older gentleman going, it is?
Yeah. What? Right, then it's just like... and of course the point is, nobody can be prepared for this. Doesn't matter how much leeway time we get.
There were a couple of moments in this picture where I legitimately had to just pause it, just walk away, because I was genuinely getting overwhelmed. But the scene that I cannot stop thinking about is that moment when Ruth comes back to her house, and it's totally quiet. She comes back to the house, and one of the bodies is upstairs, and she opens the door to the basement, and she looks down, and they don't even have to show you the bodies in the basement. All they do is they play the audio. You hear like what has to be hundreds of flies down there, and you immediately know exactly what's happened. And it's horrifying, absolutely horrifying. That and that moment where the parents, after the nuke has gone off, and they're dragging themselves out of the house to try and find their son, and all you see is his shoe sticking up out of the rubble, and the mom just gently puts her hand on the shoe, and she just starts crying. Oh my God, this is one of the toughest movies I've ever had to watch. Legitimately, I I was messed up watching this movie.
And there's
It
a
was
power
very
to
tough.
the power to the movie because there are, I don't think this is a case where scenes were shot and were cut in the edit room. I think this is a case where the writer and director said, we don't care. Who launched first? Who won? What becomes of Bob? You know, when the airstrike happens, you know, Jimmy's at work with his pal Bob, and he keeps saying, like, they've done it. And we find out Bob survived. And he kind of watches out after Ruth for a little bit. We don't find out what happened to him.
No.
What happened to Jimmy's he had a younger brother and a younger sister. The sister was probably about 13. We don't find out what happened to her. There's a lot of questions that are left to the imagination. I was curious, what happened to Bob? He was clearly watching out for Ruth. He killed a sheep and shared half the food with her. And he's gone 3 months later. We don't know what happened. Another chilling scene is when those kids are watching the educational video and there's an older woman who's mouthing the dialogue, mouthing the skeletons. And clearly she's some kind of a teacher in another life, and she's kind of trying to teach the kids some stuff, and they're making threads.
Words and pictures. Skeletons and skulls of different creatures. We borrowed them from the museum. Did you recognize what some of those skeletons were? There was the skeleton of a cat. A cat's skeleton. The skeleton of a chicken. A chicken's skeleton. The skeleton of a bird. A bird's skeleton.
We don't know. It's left to your own devices, and I don't get the impression they had shot stuff and said, oh, it's getting too long, we need to cut it. I don't get the impression this is a movie where anything got cut for censors and anything got cut by constraints. I get the impression that the movie that we saw was exactly the movie they wanted to make.
Well, you know, one of the things that I think is really interesting about Threads is that because it was made in Britain, Britain as a country is at the mercy of what the Soviet Union and America are doing at the time. Like, there's this idea, there's that scene in the pub where the guy's getting married, he's talking to his friend, and his friend's like, look, you know, if a nuclear war happens, what can I do about it? There's nothing I can do about it. And I think there's an unspoken thing throughout that film that they do have a line that the British Prime Minister comes out in favor of America's actions in the Gulf region in the film. But Britain is sort of caught in the middle. And there's this sort of melancholy attitude about the whole thing. Like, ultimately, all of Britain is fucked because of what the United States and the Soviet Union are doing. And that it's ultimately doubly tragic that all of these people, this entire country, doesn't really have a say in its own fate. And it's something that it's unstated, and maybe I'm making more of it than there really is, but it's another thing that hit me, like, yeah, once again, it's America's fault that this has happened.
No, I'm so glad you said that. Not that I was going to say, yeah, it's all your fault, but because, no, I mean, the thing that makes it more tragic than The Day After is that, yeah, it's about people who are collateral damage. I think it probably was in the mindset of people in my country at the time that this attitude of contempt for both superpowers and saying to them, blow yourselves up if you want, but leave us out of it. And of course,
yeah.
The point is, of a nuclear conflict, nobody is going to be isolated and untouched from fallout. We never find out even what happens to the rest of the country, really, although you can certainly make assumptions about that when we jump forward a couple of years.
Well, it says what happens.
We're told the population declines dramatically to what they say medieval levels, certainly. But in the short term, immediately after the blast, we're very focused on Sheffield, and we're not finding out about anything. We don't find out what happens in the other countries, nor should we care.
All the people here will be dead already. It's completely flattened. Round here, 50% will still be alive, but here, they're as good as dead already. They've probably received a lethal dose.
What about here?
Oh, it'd be pretty heavy there. If the wind's still blowing up from the west-southwest, it's in direct line from Crewe. 800 rads, 1,000, difficult to say. Depends what sort of cover they've got, of course. If they've got a decent cellar with
Put it on the radio.
Oh, right.
Not heard from country
If we don't release some food soon, we'll never get things under control.
Well, you try getting through to them. It's bloody awful.
I've got starving mobs in Sharrow, Ecclesfield, Bromfield...
Look, it's not
Marrow
our
Estate.
decision anyway. It's up to Zone to authorise the release of buffer stocks, and then it becomes a county
We
decision.
can't get through to
What are we going to do? Let them starve?
Look, even if we did have the authority...
Well, we're on our own. You've got the authority. But bloody time you did something with it.
Look, what's the point of wasting food on people who are going to die anyway?
I agree with Clive. The food stocks are not going to last long. A lot of people just didn't stock up.
How could they? The bloody shops were empty.
And now they're coming out of the shelters. I know it sounds callous, but I think we should hang on to the little food we've got.
And I need that food to force people to work.
Go and make us a cup of tea, Sharon.
Go make me yourself. I'm not your bloody wife, you know.
You never got a fag. I've got thousands of homeless bloody people up there walking around, and I've got enough on with them without being worried about bloody criminals.
Well, you're going to have to find somewhere to put them, aren't you?
Well, I don't know. Look, shoot the buggers, I don't care.
Can't we get the water tank to brew
Oh, Christ, Steve. This should have been sorted out days ago, yeah.
What about the rest centres? Can we not tell them to make their way there?
No, there'll be no point. Look, they'd be overrun anyway.
What about tents? Any tents we could use?
What? Tents? How the hell should I know? Look, if you want to know about tents, go and phone the bloody Boy Scouts.
Oh, piss off, will you? You're not the only one under pressure.
I bloody know.
You sort it.
We'll have to cut their rations. I've worked it out there. 1,000 calories for manual workers and 500 for the rest.
500? 500? That wouldn't keep a flea alive.
Should we be bothering to keep anybody alive if they can't work?
A lot of people are going to die anyway. It's back to survival of the fittest, I suppose.
What is that in terms of food, then? 500 calories?
I don't know. A few slices of bread, some soup, a lamb chop, a treacle tart, a few pints of beer. Bastards!
I mean, the film is dealing with, rather than a large ensemble cast of characters of different backgrounds, it's focusing, which we haven't really talked about so far, two families living in Sheffield who are brought together because of the most simple of domestic circumstances. The son on one side and the daughter on the other. She gets pregnant. They decide to get married and keep the child. And even when the story branches out later on to show the impact of nuclear devastation on a larger scale and show other characters, it eventually winds back to the focus of really Ruth, of this one woman, the last survivor eventually of both families, and the birth of this child mentioned right from the start of the story, and then it jumps forward in time, days, months, eventually years, and continues the story even further to the most horrifyingly bleak conclusion that can possibly be imagined.
And that's kind of the thing about the last scene, though, going back to that real quick, is that, you know, we talk about, like, actors die young. You know, Marilyn Monroe and Heath Ledger and James Dean, those are the, you know, go-to examples, as someone who died young, so they are forever known for the roles that, while they were young, while they were alive, like they are eternally youthful in the eyes of people. And yet the actress who played the daughter died young, died in a car crash, unfortunately, sadly, a couple of years, you know, after Threads aired. And you think about it, you go, you know, she is in the same league of those actors in that sense. She is eternally young, except what we remember her for is the last scene where she's dropping the body of her dead baby, about to scream, and the movie cuts. That's her forever. And that makes it even more harrowing.
We
you see what happens to Ruth. I mean, like she's this youthful. I mean, they don't specifically state how old Jimmy and Ruth are, but they're about like 18, 19. They're kids in the movie, and they're basically kind of forced into a marriage. And they choose to get married. I mean, as they say, you could get an abortion and move on, but they say no, we're going to get married. And what's interesting is that we see what becomes of her is the radiation. And
she gets the worst of it because she lives.
She gets the worst of it, and she's aged, and she dies from radiation poisoning, and is blinded with cataracts, and the fact that she clings on to this little book about bird watching that Jimmy had—that's her only physical trace of Jimmy she has left in the known world. And so when we see that quick shot of her daughter just grabbing a sweater and a couple of things in the bag, and that's it, and we see that shot, and it's so moving, and it's so just like, oh.
Well, you just reminded me of something that just occurred to me as you were saying it. In the film, when they're talking about getting married, and the parents actually say, you can have an abortion, and the little brother says when he's watching television, what's an abortion? And the parents, aren't going to tell him what an abortion is, yet what is shown as being the most horrific image in the whole film, carrying a child to term. The idea that they in the beginning of the movie, an abortion is the worst possible thing.
Yeah.
You can't tell a child what an abortion actually is. And these kids, they want to have a baby. They're going to get married and they're going to start a family, and they agree, look, that's the right thing to do. And then at the end of the movie, that whole opening sequence when they're talking about getting married and having a family is subverted by what happens at the end of the film to the most awful degree. And that's truly the final button on that movie is everything that those kids are going to do is utterly destroyed.
And the story's more ambitious. Jamie was talking about The Day After has the bigger budget, and it puts it to superb use to give it its due in the second half by being able to show traffic pile-ups and widespread rioting and the huge building crammed with victims that Steve Guttenberg walks through near the end. But it only deals with the immediate after effects of the blast. Threads takes us in its second half through several years to show us the evolution, if that's an appropriate word in this instance, of, as one character says, a diseased corpse of a country that still tries to persevere and function again. Government is re-established, a faceless totalitarian one, to be fair, but it is re-established. Local workforces are functioning again. Currency, now only being measured by food and shelter, is re-established. The remaining threads of society are reconnected. And, this film has a treatment of government. It has a position. It made me realise how little that's addressed in The Day After. It's Threads just says, curse the superpowers. The government becomes a fascist police state. And, Jamie doesn't want me to apologise, but the reason why I feel the need to is honestly because I remember, by hearing Jamie's reaction and Christina's reaction and now Peter's reaction, is that I remember I saw this film for the first time a couple of years ago, and I'll never forget the effect it had on me at the time. I know that once you've seen this film, it's truly one of those few films where you can say you will never ever forget it. There are sequences, certain images that will be burned into your brain, and it's very, very hard to get through. And I personally feel an amount of personal responsibility anytime I'm going to tell anybody to watch this film. I do feel like I prep them for it, but if you come back, and I take this message to anybody who watches this and listens to this who wants to go and see Threads, it is one of the most important films we have ever made in this country. It was heralded at the time, it won awards, it hasn't been repeated very often and doesn't get much exposure for a very specific reason, and it's simply because I just feel like some people will not be able to deal with that, and I don't think there's any shame in admitting that. I don't think you will ever see a scarier film. I don't think you will ever see a film that is harder to sit through. And for anybody, including Christina, who just feels like they would have much rather live in a world where they hadn't seen Threads, I do apologise. I am very, very sorry. And in fact, the way that we'll close is not by anything we've said, but by the movie's tagline, which sums up the film and says everything you need to know. It's the closest you'll ever want to come to nuclear war. that sums it up. And let's just say again, it's an incredibly important film. I highly recommend it, but you will never, ever forget this one, and you have been warned.